When Brian Dixon started promoting wrestling in 1970, the odds were firmly stacked against him. British wrestling wasn't an open market. It wasn't like today, where anyone could hire a ring, print some posters and run a show. The business was dominated by one organisation: joint promotions. For decades, joint promotions controlled the biggest venues, the biggest stars, and perhaps most importantly, the television cameras. If you wanted to become Britain's biggest wrestling promoter, you had to compete with a machine that had been established for decades. Most people wouldn't have even tried. Brian Dixon did. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Before we get into it, drop the video a like and give me a follow. This is part 2 of the incredible story of Brian Dixon. Throughout the 1970s, Brian slowly expanded wrestling enterprises. There were no shortcuts, no overnight successes. Every new town had to be won over. Every venue had to be secured. Every audience had to be earned. Brian understood something many promoters overlooked. If a family enjoyed your show, they'd come back. So every event had to deliver. Heroes children could believe in, villains everybody loved to hate, comedy, technical wrestling, heavyweights, lightweights, women's wrestling, a little bit of everything. Long before people started talking about sports entertainment, Brian had already realized that a successful wrestling show wasn't just about the matches. It was about sending families home smiling. That philosophy became the blueprint for Allstar wrestling. And whether people admit it or not, it's a blueprint that countless British wrestling promoters have copied ever since. One of the things that always impressed me about Brian was the respect he had from other promoters. Professional wrestling can be an incredibly competitive business. Promoters fight over venues, fight over dates, some even fight over wrestlers, but every now and then, two people come along who simply understand each other. For Brian Dixon, one of those people was Orig Williams. Better known to wrestling fans as El Bandito, Orig wasn't just one of Wales's most recognisable wrestlers, he was also one of its greatest promoters. Like Brian, he believed wrestling belonged to ordinary people, not just big cities. He took wrestling into towns across Wales and across Ireland and built a fiercely loyal following through his own promotions and later through S4C's Reslo. Brian was doing exactly the same thing in England. While other people saw competition, Brian and Orig saw opportunity. They shared wrestlers, helped one another, supported each other's promotions, and over the years built a genuine friendship that lasted for decades. It's easy to think of Brian as simply the man behind All-Star Wrestling, but his influence reached much further than that. He became part of a network of independent promoters who refused to let British wrestling disappear. Between them, Brian in England, Orig in Wales, and their friends and colleagues across Ireland, they kept professional wrestling alive in places where many believed it had no future. When Orig sadly passed away in 2009, British wrestling lost one of its true showmen. One thing became obvious very quickly. Brian had an exceptional eye for people. He could spot potential before almost anyone else. Sometimes it was an experienced wrestler who'd never quite reached the top. Sometimes it was somebody completely unknown. He wasn't interested in what someone already was. He wanted to know what they could become. And that mindset helped All-Star become home to some of Britain's finest performers. It also earned Brian enormous respect in dressing rooms across the country, because if Brian believed in you, he'd give you an opportunity. Not because you were famous, not because you knew the right people, because he thought you deserved it. And that attitude would become one of the defining characteristics of his entire career. By the early 1980s, something remarkable was happening. Brian Dixon's promotion wasn't simply surviving, it was growing. The crowds were growing, the venues were getting bigger, the quality of the wrestling was improving. Some of Britain's biggest names were choosing to work for Brian instead of relying solely on joint promotions. Kendo Nagasaki, Rollerball Rocco, Johnny Saint, Tony Sinclair, Mighty John Quinn, and so many more. Brian wasn't trying to destroy British wrestling, he was giving wrestlers another place to earn a living. Competition made everybody stronger. One of Brian's closest allies in the early years of wrestling enterprise was John Harris. Harris, the renowned joint promotions MC, left joint promotions, and through his contacts with venue managers after years of touring halls across the country, he was able to get the word out for Brian that the TV stars who had also left joint promotions were wrestling for a new outfit, and the halls were quick to snap up the new presentation who offered something different to the Big Daddy Roadshow. Then came one of the greatest achievements of Brian's entire career, one that still doesn't receive the recognition it deserves. In 1986, the year after ITV cancelled World of Sport, it made an extraordinary decision. Instead of relying solely on joint promotions for its standalone coverage of wrestling, it would also begin showing All-Star Wrestling. Think about that for a moment. Brian had started as a wrestling fan, running newsletters, helping fan clubs, taking photographs, refereeing, learning the business from the ground up. Now, his wrestling promotion was appearing on national television alongside the biggest wrestling company Britain had ever known. It wasn't handed to him. He earned it. For years, Brian had built a company that ITV simply couldn't ignore anymore. Suddenly, millions of viewers were seeing All-Star Wrestling every Saturday afternoon. Different wrestlers, different presentation, different ideas. British wrestling had genuine competition again. For decades, many believed joint promotions could never be challenged. Brian Dixon proved them wrong. A little known story actually about Brian getting the ITV contract is just before the deal was signed, the bank were going to pull the plug on Brian's overdraft. Luckily, Brian managed to convince the bank manager to hold off for a few days until the signature was on the contract, and the rest is history. Around the same period, British audiences were beginning to discover something very different: the World Wrestling Federation. Colourful, larger than life, American, exploding in popularity, ITV found itself in a unique position. On one hand, traditional British wrestling, on the other, the global phenomenon that was the WWF. And remarkably, Brian Dixon's All-Star Wrestling found itself sharing television with both. From 1986 until ITV's coverage of wrestling ended in 1988, Brian's promotion stood shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names in British wrestling and the biggest wrestling company in the world. For someone who'd started with little more than determination, it was an incredible achievement. Just as Brian reached the biggest stage of his career, everything changed. In 1988, ITV pulled the plug on professional wrestling. After more than 3 decades, weekly British televised wrestling was gone. For many promotions, that would have been the end. Without television, crowds dropped. Some of British wrestling's biggest names walked away from the business altogether. It would have been easy for Brian to do the same. He didn't. Instead, he asked a different question. If television had gone, where were the fans? And Brian already knew the answer. They were still in Britain's towns, still in its theatres, still in its holiday camps. They just needed someone willing to visit them. Brian didn't spend the next few years mourning what British wrestling had lost. He built something new. He expanded his touring schedule. He strengthened relationships with theatres and civic halls. And then he secured a partnership that would define the next decades of his career: Butlins holiday camps. That single agreement would introduce live professional wrestling to hundreds of thousands of families. It would produce future stars, create lifelong fans, and without any exaggeration, help keep British wrestling alive. For many people watching this video, including me, this is where our Brian Dixon story really begins.